Hi, everybody. We need to get started because time is short. And I just want to be very quick on this introduction, Interactive World Visions. But Eyal is going to give a talk, Hooked. And I just want to say I've been a huge fan of his work on habit design. It's extraordinary stuff. I've actually tried to get into his workshops for many years, and they're always sold out. So no further ado, Eyal.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. So we've got a few minutes together to talk about habit-forming technology in this talk I've titled Hook. I need to warn you just before we get started here that normally I teach this material in the context of a 3-week course at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford and at the Design School, and then sometimes I do private workshops for about 4 hours. I've got about 15 minutes today, so we're going to really condense this stuff, but this is a very smart crowd, so I'm sure you'll pick it all up. So, if there's one thing that we know about technology that we use every day is that it can profoundly change our behavior. And so what I've done over the past several years is to look for what patterns we can find, what can we reveal from these companies that seem to change users' behaviors in these profound ways over very short periods of time. You know, one thing that I realize that we struggle with in the augmented world industry is user adoption, is creating new habits. And so what we're going to look at for a few minutes this morning is what are these patterns that we find in companies like Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest and Twitter. What are these companies doing that allows them to so quickly and profoundly change users' day-to-day lives? I recently published this book, Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products. It's available on Amazon. There's a lot more in there. What it focuses on are these habits, these day-to-day behaviors that we do with little or no conscious thought. And I focused on habits in particular for this book because I believe that habits can help us make the world a better place. Habits can be used for good. And of course, I'm not alone. There's an explosion of companies today that are using the psychology of habit design to help people live healthier, happier, more productive, more connected lives by changing their habits, by changing these behaviors that they do with little or no conscious thought. Now, the basic pattern that I observed repeated time and time again inside these products, I call the hook model. The hook model, very simply, is an experience designed to connect your user's problem with your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. Connecting your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. And so these hooks that we find endemic to the most habit-forming products out there have 4 basic steps. Very simple. It's a trigger, an action, a reward, and an investment. And through successive cycles through these hooks, this is how habits are formed. This is how behaviors change. These are how preferences take shape. So let's walk very, very quickly through these 4 steps of the hook. The first step of these hooks is the trigger phase. Now, triggers come in 2 types, 2 flavors, if you will. External triggers and internal triggers. External triggers you'll be very familiar with. These are things all over our external environment that tell us what to do next. But what defines external triggers are that these things tell the user what to do next with some piece of information inside the trigger itself. And there's a whole explosion of opportunities when it comes to augmenting reality that provide new triggering opportunities. And that's wonderful. A lot of opportunity will be created by new, innovative external triggers. Today, we see external triggers with call to action buttons, click here, tweet now, play this. Right? Those are all examples of external triggers. But what I think designers and innovators don't think about enough, and it turns out what is critical to forming these habits, are the internal triggers. The internal triggers are things that cue the user's next action, but the information doesn't come from the trigger itself. It is informed with some piece of information that comes from an association in the user's mind. So what we do in response to being in a certain place, a certain situation, a routine around certain people, and most frequently when we experience particular emotions, dictates our next action, dictates the next technology we turn to. And in particular, it's not just any emotion. Turns out that negative emotions provide frequent internal triggers. So what we do when we feel lonesome or indecisive or tense or bored or confused or lost or fatigued dictates the technologies we instinctively turn to with little or no conscious thought. Think about it in your own lives. Oh, sorry, let me just mention this fact. Part of the research that we know this is the case comes to us from a study that showed that people with depression check email more. Now, why would that be? Why would people suffering from clinical depression check email more? Think about it for a minute. You know, I gave this talk a few weeks ago, and somebody stood up in the back of the audience and said, it's because email makes us depressed. Well, that's actually not the reason. The reason is because people experiencing clinical depression experience what psychologists call negative valence states. They feel down more frequently than the general population, and they're using technology to boost their mood, to get them out of that painful negative valence state. Let's think about this in our own lives. What technology do we use when we're feeling lonely? What do people use? Facebook, of course. What about when we're unsure about something? Before we ask our brains whether we know the answer, we Google it instantly. We don't even consider our other options when it comes to something that we're uncertain about. What about when we're bored? You know, 2 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon when there's that big project you need to work on that you really don't feel like? What do? We go onto YouTube. We check stock prices. We check sports scores. We check the news. All these solutions to these problems, these internal triggers that we face day in and day out. So what's critical about this, maybe this is a bit of interesting pop psychology, but what I want to help you do as product makers is to impart on you that it is critical that you understand, if your product needs to form a habit, you must understand what your users' internal triggers are. Absolutely critical. Very hard to scratch the user's itch unless you know what that itch actually is. You've got to understand what that internal trigger is. So that's a very, very quick 30,000-foot overview of triggers. Let's talk about the action phase of the hook. The action phase of the hook is defined as the simplest behavior done in anticipation of reward. The simplest behavior done in anticipation of reward. And let me show you how simple I mean by simple. Something as simple and easy as scrolling on Pinterest, just that act of scrolling, or searching on Google, or hitting the play button on YouTube. The simplest behavior in anticipation of reward. It turns out that there's actually a formula to help us predict these singular behaviors. And it comes to us from a researcher at Stanford by the name of B.J. Fogg. Anybody seen this before? Oh, good. OK, only a couple hands. So Fogg posits that for any human behavior B, this isn't math, by the way, don't worry. For any human behavior B, we need 3 elements. 3 things must be present for that behavior to occur. We need sufficient motivation, sufficient ability, and a trigger must be present every single time. Okay, that's all that's required. Motivation, ability, and a trigger. Motivation is defined as the energy for action, how much we want to do something. There's a lot more to be said about the psychology of motivation, but we'll pass through that for now. But basically, there are these 6 main levers that companies pull on to increase motivation. And these are that all human beings seek pleasure and avoid pain. We seek hope and we avoid fear. We seek social acceptance and we avoid social rejection. So these are these 6 levers when it comes to product messaging, when it comes to videos, when it comes to anything that influences user motivation, comes down to these 6 basic principles of motivation, these 6 basic levers. The next factor in B equals MAT is ability, the capacity to do a particular action. Right? So we need sufficient motivation, sufficient ability, and when it comes to ability, we have these 6 additional factors that make a behavior more or less likely to occur by increasing or decreasing the user's ability to do the intended behavior. So how much time is required, how much money something costs, how much physical effort, how many brain cycles. This is a big one when it comes to interactive technology because the more difficult something is to understand, the less likely the behavior is to occur. It's called cognitive load. Social deviance. We become more likely to do something when we see other people like us doing it. And then finally, non-routine. And that this is why habits are so darn important, because it turns out the more we do something, the easier it becomes. What do we call that principle? Right? It's practice. It's practice. Just the fact that we've done something makes it easier and easier to do in the future. So what we do in the future is highly dictated by what we have done in the past, and this is why habits have this repeater effect. After we figured out what the user's itch is in the trigger phase, we've prompted the user to action, the simplest action, anticipation of reward. Next comes the reward phase. Now, when it comes to rewards, we have to start in the brain. And in particular, an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens that was first studied by two researchers in Canada by the name of Olds and Milner. And what they discovered was that when they gave lab animals, and in later experiments people, this tiny button that they could press to stimulate a very special area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, that's all they wanted to do. Continue to stimulate this part of the brain incessantly. It turns out you actually don't need electrodes to stimulate the nucleus accumbens. You can stimulate this part of the brain with other things. Luxury goods and sex, junk food, certain chemicals, and of course, right there in the center, technology. All of these stimulate this very same part of the brain, the nucleus accumbens. Now, Olds and Milner thought, aha, we had discovered the brain's pleasure center, and that's what much of the psychology community believed. But it turns out we now know that is not exactly true. It wasn't pleasure that they were stimulating. It was, in fact, the stress of desire. This itch, this wanting, this instinctual response to act, that's what Olds and Milner turned out were stimulating it within the nucleus accumbens, because what we now know is that this area of the brain, the nucleus accumbens, becomes most activated in anticipation of the reward. But when we get the thing that we want, the thing that's supposed to make us feel good, the thing that's supposed to bring us pleasure, that's when the nucleus accumbens becomes less active. And it turns out that there is a way to supercharge this stress of desire, to activate this itch. Anybody want to know what it is? Anybody curious? Exactly. The unknown is fascinating. So when I took that long pause and I changed my cadence, I did something a little different. I asked you a question with a question mark at the end. I piqued your curiosity. Some of you looked up. What's he going to do next? And it turns out that this variability, this unknown, this sense of mystery heightens our engagement, increases focus, and by the way, it is highly habit-forming. Of course, the work that proved this, many of you might remember from your Psych 101 class, the work of B.F. Skinner, who found that when he put his lab pigeons inside these Skinner boxes, gave them a food pellet, every time the food pellet would come out, every time they would press the lever, they would get a food pellet. Basically, they would eat whenever they were hungry. But when he introduced an intermittent reward, some bit of variability, so sometimes the pigeon would click the lever and nothing would come out. Other times the pigeon would click the lever and they would get a reward. When there was some variability involved, the rate of response increased. The number of times that Skinner observed the behavior went up. Because what we now know is that variability activates the nucleus accumbens. It stimulates the nucleus accumbens. And so what we find is endemic to habit-forming technology. So the things that you find most engaging, the things that capture your attention, you will find one or more of these variable reward types. Rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. Let's go over them really quickly. Rewards of the tribe are all about social rewards. Things that feel good, that have an element of variability, and come from other people. Empathetic joy, feeling good because someone else feels good. Partnerships, cooperation, competition, feels good, variable, comes from other people. Rewards of the tribe. Search for resources, rewards of the hunt. These are things that stem from our primal search for food. And of course, food today is bought with money. And so money is this resource that can be shelled out on a variable basis that causes us to perk up, causes us to have more engagement. Of course, when we think of Las Vegas, when we think about casinos, that variable reward comes from those slot machines, right? There's a variability around that reward. And in fact, we see the same phenomenon occurring when we have information rewards. So think about the feed. Why is the feed so prevalent in so many technologies today? Well, let's think about it, for example. On Twitter, that's not very interesting, that's not very interesting. Oh, but that's interesting. And if I want more of that reward, what do I have to do? Just keep scrolling, right? Scrolling and scrolling. And so this looks very similar to this. both variable rewards of the hunt, this dynamic of searching and never done searching. Finally is the search for self-achievement, rewards of the self. Rewards of the self are things that feel good, that have an element of variability, but don't come from other people and aren't about these resources or information rewards. So for example, the search for mastery and consistency and competency that comes from gameplay, getting to the next level, the next achievement. Even if you're not playing with other people, these things are fun, these things are engaging, and they're variable. And if you say to yourself, I don't play these video games, I'm not much of a gamer, that's not for me, I bet you play these things every day. Right? That checking that one last message, clearing your inbox, clearing your to-do list, all examples of this search for rewards of the self. These search for competency, mastery, consistency, and control. The whole point of the variable reward phase is to give the user what they came for, to scratch the user's itch, and yet leave them wanting more. Finally, the last step of the hook model is the investment phase. The investment phase is where the user does some bit of work. They put in something into the product, which increases their likelihood of the next pass. So there's two ways that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass. The first way is that investments load the next trigger. Investments bring users back. Let me show you an example. In WhatsApp, when I send someone a message, what's my immediate gratification? What's my reward? Nada. Nothing. Nothing happens. There's no bells and whistles. Nothing goes off. Nothing really happens. What I'm doing is investing in the platform, and I'm making it more likely that I will get one of these. If I send someone a message, I make it more likely that I will get this external trigger, this notification that says, hey, someone replied back to you, and that brings me back to the system. Yep. The second way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass is by storing value. And this is one of the reasons I love working in technology. Because unlike things in the physical world, your laptops, your phones, these chairs, all of these things depreciate over time. They lose value. But habit-forming technologies should appreciate over time. They should get more and more valuable the more we use it. So for example, the more content I put into iTunes, the more valuable it becomes as my one and only music library. The more data I put into a personal finance software like Mint.com, the more I can do with it. It becomes more and more valuable with use. The more followers I have on Twitter, the more I invest, the better this product is at reaching my user base, right? Reaching my audience. And then finally, reputation. So reputation is a form of stored value that I can literally take to the bank. I can earn more money for my goods and services based on my reputation, on eBay or TaskRabbit or Airbnb, for example. So that's it. That's the hook model in a nutshell, these 4 steps that we see repeated time and time again, a trigger, an action, a reward, an investment, and through these successive cycles. This is how customer preferences are shaped, how attitudes are formed, and how habits become part of our day-to-day life. Now, that was a very, very quick overview. There's a lot more in the book and at my blog, nearandfar.com, but here's the most important slide. Here's the one you want to take a picture of. These 5 fundamental questions that you want to ask yourself when you're building a habit-forming technology. Number 1 is, what is the internal trigger that the product is addressing? Number 2, what's the external trigger that gets the user to use the product? Is the action simple enough, and can it be made simpler? Number 4, is the reward fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then number 5, what's the bit of work the user does to continue through the next pass of the hook? Now, one last thing before I go. We need to talk about the morality of manipulation. Let's face it, what we're doing here by designing habits is a form of manipulation. We need to face that fact. And we need to understand the products that we use, that we are making, are the things that people are using right before they go to bed every night. They're the first thing they reach for in the morning before they even say hello to their loved ones. And as Ian Bogo said, our technologies are quite possibly becoming the cigarettes of this century. So we have, the people in this room, the designers, the builders, the innovators, we have a very special responsibility because we have never had so much power to affect people's day-to-day lives. So what I ask you to do is to pick one of the world's problems. Engage people in something meaningful and important That's one thing we have no shortage of, is problems to fix. And so I encourage you to use the psychology of habit design to help people live happier, healthier, more productive, more connected lives, and to borrow from the words of Gandhi, to build the change that you wish to see in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nir. We have a few moments for questions while our next speaker, Ronald Azuma, sets up his slides. So I think there's a mic in the audience down here. Does anyone have a question for Nir? Everyone's like...
Sorry, that was a lot of information very, very quickly.
What was that URL?
Oh, at the end. OK, so if you want all those slides for yourself, if you go to opinion2.us, not .com, opinion2.us, you'll be taken to a very, very short survey. I'd love to know what you think about this little presentation. And then you'll be taken to my SlideShare page, which you can get all the slides you just saw.
That's opinion...
opinion2.us, opinion2.us.
Yes, I think we'll all be going to that link very shortly.
My question, you might have it in your book, but you talked about how to get people hooked. But your last comment of how do we use habit for good, how do you understand what habit would be good for them?
Yeah.
Have you looked at that question?
That is a very, very important question, because there are, the last thing you want to do is to create habits that you think are good that turn out to be not so good. And when it comes to the annals of history, there are a lot of good intentions gone awry. Right? If you look at the U.S. nutrition system, if you look at a lot of what we do in healthcare, turns out to have been misguided, turns out scientifically incorrect. So that's just one example. So we want to make sure that we're actually building the right habits, because turns out our ability to create habits is so strong that we want to make sure that we use it very wisely. So that's the first step, is to always make sure we're building the right habits, that these habits that we're building in people are actually healthy ones. That's the first step.
Unfortunately, we'll have to take the questions outside.